My best friend's husband made a move on me, and I let him. I never thought I'd betray my best friend, not in this way. But the moment her husband's hand lingered on mine just a second too long, the world tilted, and I knew I had already crossed a line I could never uncross. What happens when temptation whispers in the quiet spaces where loyalty should be? When trust is stretched thin enough to break with a single touch? Stay with me as I take you through every forbidden moment, every stolen glance, and every heartbeat that led to the night that changed everything. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The moment it happened, I told myself it was nothing, a slip, a mistake, a moment of misplaced warmth that meant absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. But that was a lie, and I knew it. I had known it from the very second my best friend's husband let his fingertips brush against my palm in that slow, deliberate way that sent a pulse of heat straight through my body. I had known it from the way my breath hitched, the way my skin burned where he touched me, the way I didn't move away. No, the way I couldn't move away. It wasn't just a touch. It was a promise. A dangerous, silent, unspoken promise of something neither of us had said aloud, yet we both understood. And I should have pulled back, should have pretended like it never happened, should have laughed it off and walked away with my hands tucked firmly in my lap where they belonged. But I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him, saw the flicker of something dark and unreadable in his eyes, and I let the moment stretch between us, heavy and thick with things we weren't supposed to feel. It started innocently enough, it always does, a dinner invitation, nothing out of the ordinary. My best friend Rachel had invited me over for an evening with her and her husband Daniel. Just the three of us, like we had done 100 times before. I had known Daniel for years, long before he was Rachel's husband. He had been her high school sweetheart, the man she had loved since she was 17, the one she had built a life with. And I had been there every step of the way, watching their love story unfold with a mixture of admiration and envy. He was the kind of man who made women feel seen, who carried himself with an effortless confidence that made him impossible to ignore. Tall, dark-hued, with sharp green eyes that seemed to notice everything. He had a presence that made you forget your surroundings. And yet, I had never thought of him as anything more than Rachel's. He belonged to her. He was part of the unshakable foundation of our friendship, the kind of relationship that should have been untouchable. That night, the air inside their house was warm, filled with the scent of garlic and roasted tomatoes as Rachel busied herself in the kitchen, her laughter ringing out between the clinking of wine glasses and the low hum of music playing in the background. I had been leaning against the counter, sipping my wine, when Daniel walked in, rolling his sleeves up to his elbows as he grabbed a bottle of red and poured himself a generous glass. Our eyes met briefly. Just a flicker of acknowledgement, nothing unusual, but then his hand brushed against mine as he set the bottle down, and everything shifted. I had felt that touch before, countless times. An accidental graze, a casual pat on the shoulder, a playful nudge. But this time, it was different. This time, it lingered. This time, he didn't move away. And neither did I. The moment stretched, silent and charged, until Rachel turned around, oblivious to the storm brewing right in front of her. "Daniel, can you help me with the salad?" she asked, her voice light and unaware. And just like that, the spell was broken. He pulled his hand away, clearing his throat as he grabbed the wooden salad bowl, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But the damage was done. That one fleeting moment had awakened something in me, something I didn't want to name, something I had no business feeling. Dinner went on as usual. We ate, we drank, we laughed. Rachel, as always, was the life of the evening, filling the air with her effortless energy, telling stories with animated hand gestures and a wide smile that made it impossible not to love her. And yet, the entire time, I was acutely aware of Daniel, of the way he sat across from me, the way he seemed just as unsettled as I was, Every time our eyes met, it felt like a secret was being shared between us, something dangerous and unspoken. And the worst part? I didn't hate it. The wine flowed freely, loosening the edges of my thoughts, making everything feel lighter, easier. Rachel got up to grab another bottle from the kitchen, and for the first time that night, Daniel and I were alone. The silence between us was thick, the air charged with something I couldn't quite define. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the last sip of wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on me in a way that made my breath hitch. "So," he said, his voice low, almost teasing. "You're quiet tonight." I forced a small laugh, pushing my plate aside as I met his gaze head-on. "Just tired," I lied. He didn't look away, didn't accept the easy excuse. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying me the way one studies something they're trying to figure out. "Is that all it is?" he asked. And there was something in his tone, something knowing, something that made my stomach tighten. Before I could answer, Rachel returned, plopping back into her seat with a dramatic sigh. "I swear, that wine rack is a black hole. I could have sworn we had another bottle of the Cabernet," she groaned, reaching for her glass. She didn't notice the way Daniel shifted in his seat, the way I swallowed hard before forcing a smile. The night carried on, but something had changed. By the time I left, my mind was a mess of tangled thoughts and conflicting emotions. I shouldn't have let that moment linger. I should have brushed it off, pretended like it was nothing, moved on like it never happened. But I didn't. Instead, I let the memory of his touch replay in my mind, let the warmth of it settle into my skin, let the thrill of something forbidden take root in a place I had no business nurturing. For days, I told myself it was nothing, a fluke, a misinterpretation, a product of too much wine and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that some doors, once cracked open, couldn't be closed again, and that knowledge sat heavy in my chest, a weight I carried with me in every interaction that followed. It was a week later when it happened again. Rachel had invited me over once more, this time for a casual movie night. I almost said no, almost made up some excuse, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself back in their house, back in that space where the air felt too thick and the boundaries felt too blurred. Rachel had fallen asleep on the couch midway through the movie, curled up against the cushions with a soft, content sigh. Daniel and I sat on opposite ends, the dim glow of the television flickering across the room, casting shadows that felt too intimate. I should have left then. I should have shaken Rachel awake, told her I was heading home, and walked out without looking back. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. I let the silence settle, let the moment stretch until Daniel shifted, turning his head toward me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. I nodded, but I didn't speak because I wasn't okay, not really. Not when his eyes were on me like that, not when his voice carried something softer, something more deliberate. "You don't have to pretend," he murmured, leaning forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know you felt it too." I sucked in a breath, my pulse hammering in my throat. There it was. The thing we hadn't spoken aloud, the thing we had both danced around for days, weeks. "I don't know what you mean," I lied, but even as I said the words, I knew he could see right through me. His lips quirked into a slow, knowing smile, his gaze flickering downward for just a second before meeting mine again. "You do," he said simply. The room felt too small, the air too warm, my body too aware of every single inch of space between us, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what was happening, of what this was turning into. I had a choice in that moment. I could get up, walk away, end this before it began, or I could stay, and I stayed. I don't know if it was the way he looked at me that night, or if it was something that had been simmering under the surface for longer than I was willing to admit. Maybe it had always been there. hidden in the quiet spaces, lurking beneath layers of restraint and unspoken thoughts. But that night, in the dim glow of the television, with Rachel fast asleep only a few feet away, the weight of it became unbearable. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It wasn't just a moment of lingering tension. It was something undeniable, something that felt like a slow burning fire, something I had no strength left to resist. And when Daniel leaned in just slightly, just enough to close some of the space between us, I knew I wasn't going to stop it. I should have. I should have thought about Rachel, about our friendship, about everything that was at stake. But I didn't. All I thought about was the way his breath felt against my skin, the way his eyes traced my lips before flickering back up to meet mine. The air between us felt electric, charged with something dangerous and intoxicating. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it, but he didn't pull away. He just sat there, watching me, waiting. And then, as if the weight of it was too much for either of us to bear any longer, he reached out, his fingers barely grazing my wrist, a touch so light it should have meant nothing. But it did. It meant everything. Because I didn't move away. I didn't flinch. I let him touch me. I let my breath hitch. I let my body betray me. His fingers curled around my wrist, slow and deliberate, testing the boundary between us, waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was frozen in place, trapped in the gravity of whatever this was. And then, as if he could see the decision flicker across my face, he shifted, his thumb brushing lightly against my pulse, feeling the way it raced beneath his touch. My lips parted, my breath shallow, but I still didn't speak. I couldn't, because if I said anything, it would make this real. It would make it something I couldn't take back, and I wasn't ready for that. Slowly, carefully, he leaned in, just a little more, his eyes never leaving mine, waiting for any sign of hesitation. But there wasn't any, because the truth was I had already decided. The moment I let his touch linger, the moment I let myself revel in the warmth of his fingers against my skin, the moment I let myself want this, I had already crossed the line. So when his lips brushed against my cheek, feather-light, barely there, I didn't pull away. And when his hand moved from my wrist to my knee, his palm pressing lightly against my bare skin, I let out the softest sigh, the kind that only he could hear, the kind that sealed my fate. Rachel stirred slightly in her sleep, shifting against the couch, and for a second, reality came crashing back. My stomach twisted, a sharp pang of guilt cutting through the haze of desire. But Daniel didn't move. He just watched me, waiting to see what I would do, waiting to see if I would come to my senses. And I almost did. I almost stood up, almost walked away, almost put an end to whatever this was before it went too far. But then he exhaled, his breath warm against my neck, and suddenly, I wasn't thinking about Rachel anymore. I wasn't thinking about anything except the way his fingers slid just a little higher, the way his lips hovered dangerously close to my ear, the way my body responded to him like it had been waiting for this moment all along. I should have been ashamed. I should have felt disgusted with myself, but all I felt was heat. All I felt was the unbearable tension between us, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around me like a vice. And then, as if he knew I was drowning in it, as if he knew I needed him to be the one to take the next step, he whispered my name. Just my name. Soft, rough, filled with something that made my whole body tremble. And before I could stop myself, before I could think about the consequences, I turned my head just slightly, just enough to close the distance, just enough to let his lips finally find mine. It was slow at first, hesitant, as if we were both waiting for the other to come to their senses, to stop this before it went too far. But when I didn't pull away, when I let my lips part beneath his, when I let my fingers dig into his arm as a quiet gasp escaped me, something inside him snapped. His hand slid up my thigh, gripping just firmly enough to make my breath hitch, and suddenly the kiss wasn't slow anymore. It was urgent, desperate, filled with weeks, maybe months, of suppressed desire. My body responded before my mind could catch up, my fingers tangling in his shirt, pulling him closer even though I knew I shouldn't. His tongue swept against mine, and I moaned softly. Too softly for Rachel to hear, but loud enough for him to know just how far gone I already was. He broke the kiss only for a second, just long enough to rest his forehead against mine, his breath coming out in ragged, uneven pants. "We should stop," he murmured, but there was no conviction in his voice, no real attempt to put space between us. His fingers traced lazy circles against my thigh, sending shivers racing up my spine, and I knew he didn't want to stop any more than I did. "I know," I whispered, but even as I said the words, I was leaning in again, pressing my lips back to his, dragging him deeper into something we both knew we shouldn't be doing. His hands roamed higher, pulling me against him in a way that made my pulse skyrocket, and I could feel just how much he wanted this, just how much he wanted me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was wrong. I knew that if Rachel woke up, if she opened her eyes and saw what was happening right in front of her, everything would come crashing down. But in that moment, I didn't care. In that moment, all that mattered was the way his hands felt on my skin, the way his mouth moved against me, the way his body pressed against me as if he couldn't get close enough. And then, just as quickly as it started, he pulled away. His chest rose and fell heavily, his eyes dark and unreadable as he looked at me. For a second, neither of us spoke. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the television, the quiet rhythm of Rachel's breathing as she slept peacefully, blissfully unaware of the betrayal unfolding only feet away from her. Daniel swallowed hard, his hand still resting against my thigh, his thumb brushing absently against my skin. "We can't do this," he said, but the way he was looking at me told me that he wasn't convinced of his own words. I nodded, but we both knew it was a lie. Because the truth was, we already had, and it wasn't over, not even close. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again. That night on the couch had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment fueled by too much wine and an attraction I had no right to feel, but deep down I knew better. It wasn't just the alcohol, it wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was something much darker, something that had been festering for longer than I was willing to admit. And as much as I tried to ignore it, as much as I told myself that I could pretend like nothing had happened, the truth was, I didn't want to stop. The guilt should have outweighed the desire, but it didn't. Instead, it only made it stronger, twisting itself into something intoxicating, something I couldn't get enough of. I avoided Rachel for days after that night, knowing that if I so much as looked at her, I wouldn't be able to hide what I had done. But avoiding Daniel was impossible. He was everywhere, in my thoughts, in my dreams, in the way my skin still burned from his touch. And every time I saw him, every time our eyes met across a crowded room, I knew he felt it too. The pull, the need, the inevitability of it all. It was only a matter of time before we gave in again. And this time we wouldn't have the excuse of alcohol or impulse. This time we would be making a choice. The next time it happened, I wasn't drunk. I wasn't caught up in the haze of an intimate night with friends. I was sober, I was aware, and I walked right into it, knowing exactly what I was doing. Rachel had asked me to stop by their house while she was at work to drop off some things she had left at my apartment. I could have left them by the door. I could have texted her later and made up some excuse for why I couldn't come inside. But instead, I knocked. And when Daniel opened the door, his expression unreadable, his body blocking the entrance like he was fighting the same war I was, I stepped over the threshold without hesitation. The air was thick with tension, suffocating in a way that made my pulse race. We didn't speak at first, just stood there in the quiet, letting the weight of our last encounter settle between us. And then, without warning, he stepped forward, closing the space between us so quickly that I barely had time to react before his hands were on me, his mouth crashing against mine with a desperation that stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't careful this time. It wasn't hesitant. It was rough, needy, filled with a hunger that had been denied for too long. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me against him, and I let him. I let myself melt into him, let my fingers dig into his shoulders, let my body answer his in a way that made it clear there was no turning back. We moved together without thinking, stumbling through the house like we couldn't get close enough, like we needed to erase every last inch of space between us. By the time my back hit the kitchen counter, I was already lost, already drowning in the feel of him, the taste of him, the way his fingers traced patterns along the bare skin beneath my shirt. He groaned against my mouth, his body pressing firmly against mine, and I felt the last of my restraint snap, the last thread of hesitation unraveling into nothing. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my lips, his breath hot and ragged, his hands shaking where they gripped my hips. I should have pushed him away, should have reminded him of the life he had with Rachel, of the fact that this, whatever this was a betrayal we could never take back. But I didn't. Instead, I whispered the only truth I could admit to myself in that moment. "I don't want you to." That was all he needed. He kissed me harder, his hand sliding up my sides, his fingers burning into my skin like a brand. I gasped against his mouth, my body arching into his as I let myself get swept away in the tidal wave of want that had been building for weeks. It didn't matter that this was wrong. It didn't matter that we were playing with fire, because in that moment, all that mattered was the way he made me feel. Alive, reckless, utterly consumed. Neither of us heard the door open. Neither of us noticed the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Not until it was too late. Rachel's voice cut through the air like a gunshot, sharp and laced with something that made my stomach drop. "What the hell is..." Every muscle in my body locked up at the sound of her voice, my blood running ice cold as reality came crashing down around me. I barely had time to react before Daniel was yanking himself away from me, his breathing heavy, his eyes wide with something that almost looked like panic. But it was too late. So late. Rachel stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes dark with something I had never seen before. She wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. She was just staring, her expression unreadable, her lips parted slightly like she was still trying to process what she had walked in on. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. What could I say? That it wasn't what it looked like? That we hadn't meant for it to happen? That it didn't mean anything? None of that would be true, because it was exactly what it looked like. We had meant for it to happen, and it meant everything. Daniel took a step forward, but Rachel raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't," she said, her voice low and shaking but firm. "Just don't." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. And then Rachel turned her gaze on me, and the look in her eyes made my stomach churn with nausea. "How long?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart hammering so loudly in my chest that I was sure she could hear it. "Rachel, How long?" she repeated, cutting me off, her jaw tightening. I hesitated for only a second, but it was a second too long. Her breath hitched, and for the first time, I saw something crack behind her eyes, a flicker of something raw, something broken. And then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. Daniel moved instantly, chasing after her, calling her name, his voice laced with panic. But I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, my entire body numb with the weight of what had just happened. I had been caught, and I had just lost my best friend forever. I didn't go after her. I didn't have the right. The moment she walked away, I knew I had done something that could never be undone. There was no apology that would make this better, no explanation that could justify what I had done. I had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And now, as I stood there in the middle of her kitchen, my body still burning from Daniel's touch, my mind spiraling in the aftermath of what had just happened, I realized that this moment, this sickening, inevitable moment, had been coming for a long time. I could still hear her voice in my head, the sharp, gutting way she had demanded to know how long it had been happening. And the worst part, I couldn't even answer her, because I didn't know. It wasn't just that night. It wasn't just the kiss. It was every stolen glance, every lingering touch, every whispered thought that we had both tried to ignore. It had started long before either of us admitted it to ourselves, creeping into the spaces where it didn't belong, growing in the shadows of restraint and unspoken desires. And now there was no more hiding, no more pretending. The truth was out. I heard the sound of raised voices coming from down the hall, Daniel's desperate pleading tone, Rachel's sharp, shaking words cutting through him like a blade. I couldn't make out exactly what she was saying, but I didn't have to. I could hear the pain in her voice, the devastation, the disbelief. And I had done that. I had put it there. A part of me wanted to run, to grab my things, slip out the back door, and disappear before she could come back and look at me with those eyes that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But another part of me, the part that knew I owed her more than that, forced me to stay rooted in place, waiting for the moment she would return and face me. The voices down the hall grew louder, and then suddenly the sound of something crashing, glass breaking, a sharp impact that made me flinch. I didn't know if she had thrown something or if Daniel had knocked something over in his attempt to calm her down, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. And then, just as suddenly, the voices stopped. Silence, thick, suffocating, more terrifying than the yelling had been. A few agonizing seconds passed, and then footsteps. Slow, steady, purposeful. And then there she was. Rachel stood in the doorway, her hands shaking at her sides, her face pale but her eyes burning with something I couldn't quite name. Not just anger, not just pain. It was something deeper, something I wasn't sure she would ever recover from. For a long moment she just stared at me, her chest rising and falling unevenly, her breath sharp and ragged like she was barely holding herself together. And I, the coward that I was, couldn't even look her in the eye. "Say something," she finally whispered, her voice raw, almost pleading. My throat closed up. I had no words, no excuse, no explanation that would make this right. "I'm sorry," I croaked, the words so pitifully small, so utterly inadequate, that I wanted to claw them back the second they left my lips. Rachel let out a bitter laugh, one that held no humor, only disbelief. "Sorry?" she repeated, her voice breaking over the word. "You're sorry?" I forced myself to look at her then, forced myself to meet the devastation in her eyes, even though it felt like my chest was caving in under the weight of it. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said. And even as the words left my mouth, I hated them. Because they weren't true. I had let it happen. I had wanted it to happen. Rachel shook her head slowly, her lips parting slightly like she was trying to find the right words but kept coming up empty. And then, finally, she let out a breath. A soft, shaky exhale that sounded more like surrender than anything else. "How long?" she asked again, her voice quieter this time, but no less demanding. I swallowed hard. "Rachel, please, How long? She snapped, cutting me off, her voice sharp enough to slice through my skin. I hesitated for too long. Her breath hitched. God, she whispered, stepping back as if she couldn't stand to be in the same space as me. It wasn't just tonight, was it? I shook my head, tears burning the backs of my eyes. No. She let out a shaky laugh, but there was nothing amused about it. Unbelievable. Rachel. No, she interrupted, shaking her head violently. You don't get to say my name like that. You don't get to stand here and pretend like you didn't rip my life apart. I flinched, the full force of her words hitting me like a slap. But I didn't move. I let her tear into me, let her say every horrible thing she wanted to say, because she had every right to. I trusted you, she whispered, and this time her voice broke completely. I trusted you with everything, and you... She stopped, shaking her head, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. You were my best friend. Were. The past tense made my stomach twist painfully. I didn't want to hurt you, I whispered, even though I knew how hollow it sounded. Rachel let out another bitter laugh, dragging her hands through her hair before looking at me like she barely recognized me anymore. Well, congratulations, she said, her voice trembling. You did. Another stretch of silence, and then she turned to leave. Panic shot through me. Rachel, please? She stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. I took a shaky step forward, my voice cracking. Please, don't let this be the end. She stood still for a long moment, her back rigid, her hands curled into fists at her sides, and then finally she turned just enough to look at me over her shoulder, her expression cold and unreadable. Already yet. And with that, she walked away. I stood there for what felt like forever, the weight of her words sinking into my bones, carving themselves into my skin like an inescapable brand. I had known this moment would come. I had known that if we got caught, if Rachel ever found out, it would destroy everything. But I had done it anyway. I had let it happen. I had let myself want something that was never mine to have. And now I had to live with the consequences. I heard the front door slam shut, the sound echoing through the empty house like the final nail in the coffin of our friendship. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never hear from her again. I had lost her. And the worst part? I had no one to blame but myself. I sat in the silence of Rachel's house long after she left, my legs feeling too weak to move, my thoughts too loud to process. The weight of what had happened pressed down on my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. The air still smelled like the perfume she always wore, the faint trace of vanilla, and something warm, something familiar. It clung to the space around me, a haunting reminder of everything I had just destroyed. I had lost my best friend. I had lost her trust, her love, her presence in my life. And for what? A fleeting moment of passion, a secret that had burned too brightly, too recklessly. My mind replayed every step that had led me here, every choice I had made, every time I could have walked away but didn't. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that even now, knowing everything I had lost, a part of me still craved the fire of Daniel's touch. That realization made me sick. I forced myself to move, to pick up my bag and leave the house that no longer welcomed me. My footsteps echoed against the tile floor as I walked toward the door, my hands trembling when I reached for the handle. I expected Daniel to come after me, to say something, anything, but he didn't. The only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerator, the remnants of an unfinished meal on the table, a life I had trespassed into, a home I had helped fracture. When I stepped outside, the night air was cold against my skin, a cruel contrast to the heat that had burned inside that house just moments ago. My car was parked under the street lamp, the light flickering slightly, casting eerie shadows across the pavement. I slid into the driver's seat, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath was uneven, shallow, and for the first time since Rachel had walked in on us, I allowed myself to cry. Tears slipped down my cheeks, silent and heavy, but they brought no relief, no undoing. There was no fixing this, no going back. I could still hear Rachel's voice in my head, the way it had cracked when she said, "You were my best friend." When? Past tense, final. I had done something unforgivable. The drive home was a blur, the city lights streaking past me like ghosts. My mind was a tangle of regret and shame, my body aching with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. When I pulled into my apartment parking lot, I didn't get out right away. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, searching for something in my own eyes that would tell me who I had become. But I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She was a stranger. I had spent my whole life believing that I was a good person, that I was loyal, that I was the kind of woman who valued friendship above all else. And yet, when it had come down to it, I had betrayed the one person who had trusted me the most. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What did that say about me? I thought about calling Rachel, about trying to fix what was broken, but what could I possibly say? That I was sorry? That I hadn't meant for this to happen? She wouldn't believe me, and even if she did, it wouldn't matter. Some betrayals were too deep to be forgiven. Instead, I reached for my phone and scrolled to Daniel's number, my thumb hovering over the screen. My breath hitched as I stared at it, my mind waging a war against itself. Would he call me first? Would he try to explain himself? Would he regret it as much as I did? Or worse, would he not regret it at all? I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know if I wanted him to fight for me, to say that what we had meant something, or if I wanted him to disappear, to make it easier for me to pretend like this had never happened. In the end, I didn't call him. I threw my phone onto the passenger seat and pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, taking deep, shaky breaths. What the hell had I done? Sleep didn't come that night. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my body stiff with the weight of guilt. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face. The way she had looked at me like I was a stranger. The way she had walked away without looking back. I thought about all the years we had spent together. Every late-night conversation, every time we had confided in each other, every time we had promised that no matter what happened, we would always have each other. Lies. Or maybe once they had been true, before I ruined everything. The next morning, I woke to a text from Daniel. A single message. "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. I didn't know what he wanted to say, but I wasn't sure I could handle hearing it. Was he sorry? Was he ashamed? Did he regret it? Or worse, did he want to keep this going? I didn't reply. I didn't know if I ever would. Rachel didn't reach out. She didn't need to. I knew, deep in my bones, that she was done with me. I had lost her for good. Days passed, then weeks. The world kept moving, but I felt stuck in the moment of my betrayal, unable to move forward, unable to escape the weight of what I had done. I went to work. I smiled when I had to. I acted like everything was fine. But inside, I was unraveling. And Daniel, he didn't text again. I wondered if he had gone back to Rachel, if he had tried to make things right, or if he had simply walked away from it all, the way he had walked away from me that night. I told myself I didn't care, but I did. I wanted him to suffer the way I was suffering. I wanted him to feel the loss as deeply as I did, but I knew that was selfish. The truth was, I had done this to myself, and now I had to live with it. There was no redemption in this story, no moment of clarity that made it all okay. There was just the weight of my choices, the knowledge that I had destroyed something that could never be repaired. I used to believe that love was the strongest thing in the world, that it could survive anything. But betrayal was stronger, and it left nothing but ashes in its wake. It had been months since that night, months since Rachel had walked out of her own home, her world shattered by the betrayal I had inflicted. I hadn't heard from her since, not a single word, no late-night texts, no familiar voice calling my name. The silence was worse than any screaming match, worse than any tear-filled confrontation. It was a void, and I was drowning in it. Daniel had tried, he had called, he had texted, at first just a few times, then more, then constantly. We need to talk. Please, just hear me out. I need to see you. I had ignored them all. I wanted no part of him anymore, no part of the destruction we had caused. But the damage was done, and it was irreversible. I thought time would dull the edges of my guilt, but if anything, the weight of what I had done had only gotten heavier. I felt it in every quiet moment, in the emptiness where Rachel used to be, in the knowing glances from mutual friends who had clearly taken her side, the whispers, the judgment, the loss. It was all deserved. But what I didn't expect was the letter. It arrived in the mail one morning, tucked between useless flyers and bills, its crisp white envelope standing out in its simplicity. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in familiar cursive. Rachel. My stomach twisted as I tore it open, my hands trembling slightly. I braced myself for rage, for closure, for whatever she had left to say. But as I unfolded the paper, my breath caught in my throat. I know everything now. That was all it said. No explanation. No accusations, just those 3 words scrawled across the page like a verdict. I read them over and over, trying to make sense of them, but no matter how many times I stared at them, the meaning didn't change. She knew, but what did she mean by everything? Panic crawled up my spine. Had she found out more than just what she had seen that night? Had Daniel told her something else? Had someone else? I hadn't spoken to him, hadn't spoken to anyone, and yet something in the air shifted with that letter, something unsettling and raw. And then my phone rang. Not a text, a call. I flinched at the sound, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I grabbed it from the table. My breath hitched when I saw the name flashing across the screen. Rachel. She hadn't called me once in all these months. She had made it clear that she never wanted to see me again. So why now? With shaky hands, I pressed the answer button and lifted the phone to my ear, barely able to force out a whisper. Rachel. Silence. I strained to listen, to hear any sign that she was there, but all I got was breathing. Slow, steady, measured. Then, just when I was about to say her name again, she finally spoke. You don't think you ever really knew him. Her voice was different, hollow, almost amused. My mouth went dry. Rachel, what? You think you stole him from me? She interrupted, her tone eerily calm. That you ruined my marriage? That's cute. My stomach clenched at the ice in her voice. Of course you did, she said smoothly, like it was obvious. But not in the way you think. A chill ran down my spine, a cold sweat breaking across my skin. Rachel, what's going on? A pause, a beat of silence, then a soft chuckle. Did you really think you were the first? The words landed like a slap, my breath catching in my throat. What? Daniel? Her voice turned sharp, almost mocking. You thought you were special, didn't you? That you were the exception? That your little secret moments meant something? She let out another quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. God, you're pathetic. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me, my grip tightening on the phone. Rachel, stop. He's been cheating on me for years, she continued, her voice light, almost conversational. Different women, different stories. He gets bored easily, you see. Always looking for the next thrill. You weren't his first. A pause. And you sure as hell won't be his last. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. You're lying. Am I? She mused. Did he tell you he loved you? Did he promise you things? Tell me, did he make you feel special? My throat was too tight to respond. Rachel sighed, like she was disappointed in me. I used to cry over it, she admitted. Every time I found out. Every time I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, he would stop. That I was enough. A long pause. But then I realized something. I didn't have to be enough. I just had to be smart. I frowned, my body rigid with unease. What do you mean? You thought I caught you, didn't you? She murmured. You thought I walked in at the worst possible moment. Her voice dropped, softer now, but somehow more menacing. But, sweetheart, I walked in exactly when I was meant to. A shiver crawled down my spine. What? I knew. Her voice turned sharp again. I knew long before I opened that door. I knew the moment you started looking at him differently. The way you lingered when he spoke, the way your voice softened when you said his name. A bitter chuckle. You were so predictable. I felt dizzy. Rachel, why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand, she said, her tone dripping with something unreadable. I didn't lose Daniel that night. I let him go. My lips parted, but no words came. I wanted you to take him, she continued, her voice razor sharp. Because he was already yours, wasn't he? At least that's what you wanted to believe. A pause. But here's the thing about men like Daniel. They never belonged to anyone. A knot formed in my throat. Do you know where he is right now? She asked, her voice almost playful. I swallowed hard. He's with someone else. My heart stopped. He moved on weeks ago, she added. Maybe even before I left. Maybe even before you. She let the silence drag for a moment before she continued. So tell me, was it worth it? My stomach twisted violently. Rachel, I just thought you should know, she murmured. Since you were so convinced you won something. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. Daniel hadn't reached out in weeks. He had said we need to talk, but he never did, because he never needed to, because he was already gone. Rachel sighed again, and this time there was something final about it. Goodbye, she said softly, and good luck. You're going to need it. The line went dead. I sat there, my phone still pressed to my ear, my hands trembling. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of her words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I thought I had taken something from her. I thought I had won. But in the end, I had only been playing a game I never had a chance of winning. And Rachel, she had been the one holding the cards all along. I sat there for what felt like hours, my phone still clutched in my hand, my mind spiraling through every word Rachel had just said. My body felt numb, drained of every ounce of heat, every trace of energy. I had prepared myself for the pain of losing her, for the silence that would stretch between us, but I had never prepared for this. Never prepared to hear that I had never meant anything at all, that I wasn't special, that I was just another name on Daniel's long, endless list. The nausea hit me suddenly, sharp and violent. I barely made it to the bathroom before I fell to my knees, heaving into the toilet, my body rejecting the weight of everything I had just learned, the betrayal, the humiliation, the realization that I had destroyed my entire life for a man who had already moved on. I had let myself believe it was something real, something rare, something that couldn't be ignored, that I had been a fool. Rachel had played me from the beginning. She had known. She had seen it coming, and instead of stopping me, instead of saving me from myself, she had let me walk straight into my own ruin. She had let me believe that I had taken something from her, let me hold on to the sick, twisted fantasy that I had been the one Daniel wanted, that I hadn't been chosen at all. I had been discarded. The thought sent another wave of nausea rolling through me, but there was nothing left to bring up. I leaned back against the cold tile floor, my head falling against the cabinet behind me, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. How had I let this happen? How had I let myself become this? I had spent my entire life believing I was better than this, that I was strong, that I was loyal, that I would never, never betray someone I loved. And yet, the moment temptation had whispered in my ear, the moment Daniel had touched me, I had fallen. I had crumbled. And now I had nothing left. Rachel was gone. Daniel was gone. My reputation, my friendships, my sense of self, all of it had been stripped away, leaving nothing but the cold, empty wreckage of the choices I had made. And the worst part, I deserved it. I pulled myself up from the floor, gripping the edge of the sink for support as I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, rimmed with dark shadows that hadn't been there before. I looked like a woman who had lost everything, and I had. Rachel had been right about one thing. Daniel had already moved on. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, hadn't seen him, hadn't even caught a glimpse of him in the places we used to go. He had vanished, just as quickly as he had come into my life, like a shadow that had never truly existed. I had wanted to believe that he had loved me, that he had felt something real, but now I knew the truth. I had been nothing more than a distraction. A game? A mistake. Tears burned in my eyes, but I forced them back. I had wasted enough tears on Daniel, on the fantasy of him, on the lie I had let myself believe. I needed to move on. I needed to figure out who I was without him, without Rachel, without the weight of my own shame dragging me down. But how? How did you rebuild when you had burned everything to the ground? I didn't have an answer. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine, of going through the motions, of pretending I was fine when I was anything but. I went to work. I smiled when I had to. I avoided the places where I might see people who had once been a part of my life. I existed in the quiet, in the solitude of my own regret. I told myself that this was what I deserved, that this was my punishment. But the truth was, I didn't know how to be alone with myself. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face, the way she had looked at me when she realized what I had done, the betrayal in her eyes, the disappointment, the disgust. And every time I thought of Daniel, I felt sick. The things he had said to me, the way he had touched me, the lies he had spun. I had fallen for all of it. I had let him pull me under, let him make me believe I was different, that I hadn't been different at all. I had just been the next one in line. One day as I was leaving work, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. My heart jumped into my throat as I hesitated, staring at the screen. For a brief, foolish second, I thought it might be Rachel. But it wasn't. It was Daniel. My fingers trembled as I debated whether or not to answer. Part of me wanted to hear his voice, wanted to know if he missed me, if he regretted it, if any of it had ever meant anything to him. But the other part of me, the part that had spent the last few months unraveling under the weight of what I had done, knew better. So I let it ring, and then I blocked his number. I was done chasing ghosts. I drove home in silence, my thoughts heavy, my body exhausted. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something shift inside me. I had been waiting for Daniel to reach out, waiting for Rachel to forgive me, waiting for the pain to fade, for the weight of my choices to stop crushing me. But I couldn't wait anymore. I needed to move forward, even if I didn't know how. The next morning, I sat down and wrote Rachel a letter. I didn't expect her to read it. I didn't expect her to forgive me, but I needed to say the words, needed to put them out into the world, even if she never saw them. Rachel, there's nothing I can say that will ever make this right, nothing I can do that will undo what I did, but I need you to know that I will never stop regretting it. I will never stop being sorry. You were my best friend. You were my sister, and I destroyed that. I destroyed us. And I have to live with that. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything at all. But I want you to know that I have finally accepted what I did, and I will never try to justify it. I was selfish, I was weak, and I broke something that can never be repaired. I hope you find happiness. I hope you find peace. And I hope, one day, you can think of me without hate in your heart. I love you. I always will, even if you never believe that again. Goodbye. I sealed the letter and left it on her doorstep. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. This was my burden now, and I would carry it for the rest of my life. I never heard back from Rachel. I hadn't expected to, but part of me had still hoped. Hope was a strange thing, even when you knew better than to hold on to it. I had spent months drowning in the guilt of what I had done, and for what? For a man who had already forgotten me, for a friendship that could never be repaired, for a life that no longer existed. The truth was, I had been holding on to ghosts, clinging to a past that no longer belonged to me, and finally, I had to let go. After I left the letter on her doorstep, I didn't linger. I didn't wait to see if she would pick it up, didn't hope for some dramatic confrontation that would bring clarity or closure. I had said my piece, and now it was up to her. Maybe she would throw it away. Maybe she wouldn't even open it. Or maybe, late at night, when the house was quiet and she was alone with her thoughts, she would read it. And maybe, just maybe, she would understand that, despite everything, I had loved her, that my betrayal hadn't come from a place of malice, but from something broken inside of me that I hadn't been able to control. But it didn't matter anymore. I had to move forward, whether she forgave me or not. The city felt different now, smaller, lonelier. Places that had once been familiar were now tainted with memories I didn't want to relive. The coffee shop where Rachel and I had spent hours talking about everything and nothing. The restaurant where Daniel had first touched my hand under the table. Where my stomach had flipped with something dangerous and thrilling. The bookstore where I had bought her birthday gifts every year, knowing exactly which authors would make her smile. These places were no longer mine. They belonged to another version of myself, a woman who no longer existed. I found myself avoiding them, taking different streets, making new routines. I had built a cage around myself, convinced that this was the life I deserved now, a life of solitude, of silence, of living in the aftermath of my own destruction. But one afternoon, as I walked aimlessly through the city, I found myself standing in front of a familiar bar. It was the place where Daniel had first confessed his attraction to me, where the weight of our unspoken desires had finally spilled over into words, where I had made the first decision that had led to everything unraveling. I should have turned away, but I didn't. I walked inside, letting the dim lighting and the low hum of conversation wash over me. It was crowded, filled with people laughing, drinking, living. I had spent so long drowning in guilt that I had forgotten what it felt like to be part of the world, to exist outside of my own regret. I slid onto a bar stool and ordered a drink, my fingers tracing the rim of the glass as I let my mind wander. I thought about Rachel, about Daniel, about the version of myself that had thought she was untouchable, that had believed she could make choices without consequences. That woman was gone, and in her place was someone who had been forced to confront the worst parts of herself. I wasn't sure if I liked who I had become, but at least I knew her now. As I sipped my drink, I felt a presence beside me. A man slid onto the stool next to mine, his cologne faint but familiar. I didn't turn to look at him. I didn't need to. I wasn't sure if you'd ever come back here, Daniel's voice murmured, smooth and confident, like nothing had ever happened, like we were still playing our dangerous little game. My fingers tightened around my glass, but I didn't react. I didn't come here for you. He chuckled softly, the sound making my skin prickle. You sure about that? I finally turned to face him, and for the first time since Rachel had caught us, I really looked at him. And what I saw made my stomach twist. He was the same, that same cocky smirk, that same effortless charm, that same confidence that had once made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. But now, I saw through it. I saw the emptiness behind his eyes, the lack of sincerity in his words. He wasn't here because he missed me. He was here because he was bored, because he had moved on from his latest distraction and was circling back, wondering if I was still weak enough to let him back in. I took a slow sip of my drink, then set it down carefully. Let me guess, I said, tilting my head. It didn't work out with whoever came after me? He smiled, but there was something sharp about it, something predatory. You always were smart. I laughed then, a hollow sound, because it was true. I had always been smart, but I had been stupid when it came to him. I leaned in slightly, just enough to make him think for a fleeting second that I was still the same woman who had once fallen for his lies. And then, in the calmest voice I had ever used, I said, I'd rather set myself on fire than go through that again. His smile faltered, his confidence flickering just slightly, and it was the most satisfying thing I had felt in months. I grabbed my purse and stood up, leaving my half-finished drink on the bar. I didn't need it anymore. As I walked toward the door, Daniel called after me. You'll regret this. I stopped, just for a second, just long enough to turn my head slightly over my shoulder. No, I said, my voice steady, unwavering. Regret is what got me here in the first place. I'm done with it. And with that, I walked out. The air outside was cool, crisp, the night alive with possibilities I hadn't let myself consider in so long. For the first time, I felt light, free. Rachel might never forgive me. I might never fully forgive myself. But I wasn't going to let this be the end of me. I had lost so much, but I had gained something too. Clarity. The knowledge that I would never, ever let myself be that woman again. The world stretched out in front of me, vast and open, filled with roads I hadn't taken yet. And finally I was ready to walk them alone.